Welcome back to Boss Invests. For over 30 years, Australia has been the envy of the developed world, a nation that seemingly avoided every global recession. But that prosperity wasn't just luck. It was built on a single massive bet: the rise of China. We dug up our backyard to build their cities, and in return, they fueled our economy. But today, that relationship is changing. As China's growth slows and geopolitical tensions rise, Australia finds itself in a precarious position. Today, we are unpacking the dragon's grip, Australia's strategic dependency on China. Are we too reliant on a single superpower? And what happens to the Australian dollar, our housing market, and your investments if the dragon stops buying? For nearly 3 decades, the Australian economy has defied gravity. While the rest of the developed world buckled under the weight of the dot-com crash, the 2008 global financial crisis, and the stagnation of the Eurozone, Australia kept marching forward. We told ourselves this was due to superior economic management, a robust banking sector, and the sheer grit of the Australian worker. We called ourselves the lucky country. But if you peel back the layers of our GDP, you find that our luck was largely imported. It arrived on the backs of bulk carriers navigating the shipping lanes of the South China Sea. For 30 years, Australia has effectively operated as the quarry for the largest industrialisation project in human history, the rise of modern China. This economic symbiosis created a golden era of prosperity. It filled our tax coffers, supercharged our superannuation funds, and artificially inflated the Australian dollar, giving us purchasing power that masked a hollowing out of our domestic manufacturing. But the world of 2024 and beyond is not the world of 2008. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting. The dragon that fueled our growth is now facing its own internal crisis. A property collapse, demographic decline, and a shift away from the infrastructure-heavy growth that devours Australian steel. Simultaneously, the strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing has placed Canberra in an impossible position, relying on the United States for security, but dependent on China for solvency. We are now witnessing the early tremors of a structural realignment. The rivers of gold that flowed from the Pilbara are beginning to dry up. The terms of trade are softening, and for the average Australian household, this macroeconomic abstraction is about to become a kitchen table reality. We are a small, open economy in a world that is becoming closed and hostile. The question is no longer about how we maximise the boom, but how we survive the unwind. In this analysis, we will unpack the mechanics of Australia's deep entanglement with China, the risks of this concentration, and what happens when the one engine keeping the Australian economy afloat begins to sputter. This is not just a story about iron ore and coal. It is a story about the end of an era and the uncertain dawn of a new, harder economic reality. The first cracks in the edifice are appearing not in the suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne, but in the futures markets of Singapore and Dalian. For years, the spot price of iron ore has been the single most important number in the Australian economy, effectively acting as a sovereign hedge fund that bailed out successive government budgets. When iron ore trades above $100 a tonne, the federal treasurer looks like a financial genius, and the budget surplus swells. But as China's construction sector implodes, burdened by millions of unfinished homes and the collapse of mega developers like Evergrande, that demand is evaporating. We are seeing a structural shift from a construction-led China to a high-tech China. And a high-tech manufacturing requires significantly less Australian dirt than building ghost cities does. This softening of demand creates a gaping hole in our national revenue, precisely at a time when government spending on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS, defence, and debt servicing is skyrocketing. But the crisis is not just fiscal, it is monetary. The Australian dollar, AUD, is widely traded by global hedge funds as a liquid proxy for Chinese growth. When China sneezes, the AUD catches a cold. As commodity prices dip, our currency loses value against the US greenback. This sounds abstract until you visit the petrol station or the supermarket, because Australia has effectively hollowed out its manufacturing base, we import almost all our finished goods: fuel, cars, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. A weak dollar imports inflation directly into the Australian household. We are effectively importing the consequences of China's slowdown in the form of higher prices at the checkout. This brings us to the most uncomfortable statistic of all: the per capita recession. While the government boasts of headline GDP growth, this is a mirage fueled entirely by record levels of migration. If you strip out the population increase, the economic output per person has been shrinking for consecutive quarters. The average Australian is becoming poorer, producing less and buying less, masking a silent standard of living depression behind a veil of population-driven statistics. We are running faster just to stand still, and the treadmill is controlled by a foreign power that is slowly turning down the speed. To fully grasp the magnitude of the threat, one must visualise the Australian economy not as an independent island, but as a small vessel navigating a narrowing strait between two colliding titans. On one side, we have the People's Republic of China, a nation that absorbs nearly 1/3 of our total exports. This level of trade concentration is almost unprecedented for a developed Western democracy. In 2020, Australian exporters received a brutal education in the mechanics of economic coercion. Following Canberra's call for an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, Beijing retaliated with punitive tariffs and bans on Australian barley, wine, timber, coal, and lobster. It was a calculated warning shot. We buy your goods, therefore we influence your policy. While iron ore was spared, primarily because China had no viable alternative supplier at the time, the psychological damage was done. The incident revealed that Australia's prosperity is conditionally leased, subject to geopolitical compliance. However, while our national income is effectively determined in Beijing, our cost of living is largely dictated by Washington, D.C. This is the second arm of the economic pincer. The Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, often speaks of independence, but the reality of global finance is that the RBA is tethered to the US Federal Reserve. When the US Fed raises interest rates to combat American inflation, Australia is forced to follow suit, regardless of our domestic conditions. If the RBA refuses to match US rate hikes, the interest rate differential widens. Global capital, seeking the highest risk-free return, flees Australian bonds for American treasuries. This capital flight crushes the value of the Australian dollar, which in turn sends the cost of imported fuel and goods skyrocketing, creating more inflation. This creates a nightmare scenario for policymakers in Martin Place, a stagflationary trap. We are facing a future where a slowing China drags down our export revenue, threatening recession, while a resilient US economy forces us to keep interest rates high, crushing mortgage holders. The RBA could be forced to hike rates into a crumbling economy, kicking the Australian consumer while they are down, simply to defend the currency from collapse. We have effectively outsourced our demand to Asia and our monetary sovereignty to America, leaving our own government with very few levers to pull when the global currents turn against us. To understand the magnitude of Australia's strategic failure, we must hold a mirror up to our international peers. The most damning comparison is with Norway. Both nations are stable democracies, blessed with small populations and massive geological endowments. Oil for Norway, minerals for Australia. But they chose radically different paths. Norway treated its resource wealth as a temporary windfall, taxing it aggressively and funneling the proceeds into a sovereign wealth fund that now sits at over $1.6 trillion. Effectively, every Norwegian is a millionaire on paper, protected by a financial fortress that insulates the domestic economy from global volatility. Australia, by contrast, treated the mining boom not as a bonus, but as a permanent raise. Successive governments in the early 2000s used the surge in mining royalties to fund middle-class welfare and permanent income tax cuts. We spent our inheritance before we had even secured it, leaving us with a structural deficit the moment commodity prices softened. Closer to home, the comparison with Canada serves as a grim ghost of Christmas future. Like Australia, Canada is a resource-heavy economy with a banking oligopoly and a housing market that has detached from reality. Canada is currently grappling with a collapse in labour productivity and a standard of living that is falling behind its southern neighbour. It is a warning of what happens when a nation relies on selling assets, real estate and resources, rather than creating value. This phenomenon is known as Dutch disease. As the mining boom drove the Australian dollar to parity with the US greenback in the early 2010s, it made our other exports uncompetitive. We watched our car manufacturing industry die, our textile industry vanish, and our complexity wither. Today, according to the Harvard Economic Complexity Index, Australia ranks 93rd in the world, sandwiched between Uganda and Pakistan. We are a rich nation with the industrial diversity of a developing one, leaving us uniquely exposed now that the commodity supercycle is turning. We bet the house on a single client, and in doing so, we forgot how to make anything else. The transmission mechanism from the iron ore pits of the Pilbara to the leafy suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne is direct, yet often misunderstood. For 2 decades, the surplus capital generated by our trade with China did not merely sit in corporate bank accounts. It recycled into the Australian residential property market, creating one of the most expensive housing bubbles on Earth. During the peak years of the 2010s, Australia was not just exporting minerals. We were selling off our geography. Chinese capital controls were looser and billions flowed into Australian apartments and high-end real estate, effectively decoupling local housing prices from local wages. This created a wealth effect where Australians felt richer not because they were more productive, but because their homes were earning more than they were. However, this reliance on property as the primary vehicle for national wealth has created a single point of failure. The Australian banking system is uniquely exposed. The Big Four banks are, in reality, massive real estate hedge funds with a banking licence attached, with upwards of 60% of their loan books tied to residential mortgages. This concentration risk is staggering. In the US, banks are diversified across diverse industries. In Australia, the banks are betting the house on the house. Now, as the geopolitical tide turns, the vulnerabilities are exposed. We have a household sector carrying one of the highest debt-to-income ratios in the world, hovering around 190%. This mountain of debt was serviceable when interest rates were near zero and China was booming. But in a world of higher for longer rates, driven by US inflation and softening Chinese demand, the mathematics of the mortgage belt are breaking down. We are seeing the fixed-rate cliff claim its victims, with households cutting back on all discretionary spending to service their loans. This turns the housing market from an engine of growth into a black hole that sucks liquidity out of the real economy. If the China income that underpins our employment and tax revenue falters, the ability of Australians to service this mountain of debt comes into question, threatening not just individual solvency, but the stability of the entire financial system. In the corridors of power in Canberra and Martin Place, the realisation has finally set in: the China hedge is gone. The response from the federal government has been a frantic pivot toward economic diversification. We see this in the heavily publicised trade missions to India and the scramble to sign free trade agreements with the UK and Southeast Asia. The political narrative is that India will be the new China. However, this is dangerous wishful thinking. India's growth model is largely service-based and internal consumption-driven, not infrastructure-intensive. It simply does not need Australian iron ore to build ghost cities on the scale that China did. There is no single customer on Earth capable of replacing the voracious appetite of the Chinese industrial machine of the 2010s. The government's flagship Future Made in Australia policy, a multi-billion-dollar attempt to subsidise green hydrogen and critical minerals processing, is a tacit admission that the simple dig and ship model is reaching its expiration date. Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, is fighting a lonely war on a second front. The governor speaks of a narrow path to bring inflation back to the 2 to 3% target band without crashing the economy into recession, but that path is becoming a tightrope walk over a canyon. The RBA is effectively trapped in a game of chicken with the federal government, while the central bank keeps interest rates restrictive to suck demand out of the economy. The Treasury is pumping billions back in via energy rebates, NDIS spending and state-level infrastructure projects to keep employment numbers high. We have the fiscal accelerator and the monetary brake pressed simultaneously. This policy incoherence creates a volatile environment where service inflation remains sticky for longer, forcing interest rates to remain elevated even as the private sector bleeds. The national strategy appears to be pray for a soft landing, but in a world where our biggest customer is slowing down and our biggest security partner is exporting inflation, the landing gear may not deploy at all. For the individual Australian investor and household, the macro strategic shift we have outlined requires a fundamental rewriting of the personal financial playbook. For 30 years, the winning strategy was simple: leverage into residential property, ride the wave of falling interest rates, and rely on the China-fueled resources boom to keep the economy buoyant. That era of easy beta is over. In a world of structural inflation and geopolitical volatility, the set and forget mindset is a recipe for wealth erosion. The first line of defense in this new landscape is the recognition that your primary asset is no longer your house, but your human capital. In a per capita recession, where real wages are stagnant and job security is threatened by slowing growth, the ability to pivot, upskill, and maintain income velocity is the only true hedge against the rising cost of living. We are moving from an era of passive asset accumulation to an era of active asset preservation. Furthermore, Australians suffer from a dangerous home bias. We work in Australia, earn in Australian dollars, own Australian real estate, and have our superannuation heavily weighted toward Australian banks and miners. This is a concentration risk of the highest order. If the China thesis breaks, every aspect of your financial life takes a hit simultaneously. A sophisticated strategy now demands international diversification. This means looking beyond the ASX, which is dominated by the very banks and miners most exposed to the downturn, and allocating capital to global markets, technology, and foreign currencies that act as a hedge against a depreciating Australian dollar. If the AUD is structurally destined to fall as commodity prices soften, holding unhedged global assets protects your global purchasing power. Finally, the management of debt must change. When interest rates were 2%, debt was a tool for wealth creation. At 6% or 7%, debt is a wealth destroyer. Paying down non-deductible mortgage debt is now arguably the best risk-free investment available, offering a guaranteed tax-free return that outstrips most volatile market yields. The game has changed from how much can I borrow to how resilient is my balance sheet. Australia stands at a definitive crossroads, the comfortable inertia of the last 30 years, where we could simply dig rocks, sell them to a booming Asia, and use the proceeds to bid up our own housing market is over. We are now drifting into uncharted waters if we continue on our current trajectory. The two Australias will not just be an economic statistic, but a permanent social fracture. We risk becoming a society that resembles the stratified rentier economies of South America more than the egalitarian ethos of our own history. A place of gated communities and working poverty where social mobility is a myth we tell ourselves to sleep at night. The global tide that lifted our boat for so long is going out, and it is revealing the structural fragility of an economy that forgot how to make things. But demography and destiny are not the same thing. The lucky country was originally a phrase coined by social critic Donald Horne in the 1960s, not as a compliment, but as a warning, a critique of a nation that relied on luck rather than leadership or innovation. To reclaim our future, we must finally heed that warning. We need the political courage to touch the third rail of tax reform, shifting the burden away from income and effort and onto land and resource rents. We need to pivot from being a passive quarry to an active powerhouse of renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, and technology. The tools to fix this exist. What is missing is the collective will to endure the short-term pain required for long-term survival. The question is no longer whether the boom will end. It already has. The question is what we build in its ashes. Will we remain a nation of landlords and tenants drifting apart in a sea of debt? Or will we do the hard work of building a complex, resilient economy that rewards contribution over accumulation? The sun is setting on the Australia of the past. The Australia of the future will not be built on luck. It will be built on choices. And the time to choose is running out. We've analysed the dragon, but what about the eagle? In our next episode, we ask the controversial question, has Australia traded its economic sovereignty for security? We are investigating the real price of the AUKUS deal and our deep ties to Washington. You do not want to miss the 51st state, the true economic cost of the US-Australia alliance. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because this is a story the government doesn't want you to worry about.